Prime time.
Greetings, and welcome back to Mediocre Minis. This time around, we're going to be taking our Arch-Revenant, which we built last time. This little guy right here. We're going to be putting on a little bit of basing materials, such as rocks, to give it a little bit more life. And then we're going to go outside to the garage, bust out some primer, and paint this thing up. And the importance of using primer on miniatures, especially on gray plastic, is that while some paint will adhere to it, it is nice to have a good, solid base coat down on any material before you end up putting on your expensive and nice paints. You paint primer onto your walls, sometimes onto bare wood, and many other fixtures in your home. Prime them just to prepare the surface. Now, primer works in many different ways. Mostly it covers up anything that is beneath the primer, such in this case, all the gray plastic. And also, it acts as a nice bonding agent for our acrylic paints to stick onto. So, with that in mind, first thing we're going to do is put on some basing materials, which you don't have to do, but I would like to do it just to spice up the miniature a little bit. Then, once that's all adhered and dried, head outside, start priming. So I should first mention that this step here is actually completely optional. You do not have to put any materials on the base if you don't want to, and you can just leave it as a black base if you prefer. However, over time you might find interested in starting to spice it up and put a little bit of flavor into your bases. A few things that you're going to need is first some type of glue. I like to use Elmer's glue, or any other type of PVA glue will work out just fine. You do not necessarily need anything specific, however, not all glues are created equal. You want something thick, but not too thick. Second, a old brush. This one here is a cheap brush that I got from Michael's, and you definitely want something that isn't something that you plan on using especially for painting, because chances are, putting this in glue, it could potentially get ruined, so a cheap brush is definitely something that you would want to have for helping to adhere materials to your base. Finally here, I have some materials here. These are actual little stones. They come in gray. They came in a few different shades. I actually got this container from Michael's also, and taking a look inside, it almost looks like little pebbles. It's bigger than sand grains, but this works perfectly for adhering what looks to be small rocks to any base that you want. I also here have a second jar. These are the same type of material, except they are a little bit larger. They can use to be looked as larger rocks or even some small boulders. It is important to remember the size when dealing with basing materials. If you use larger rocks from your driveway, for instance, it'll look huge in comparison to the small miniature. So scale is definitely something you want to keep in mind for basing. Alright, let's get started. Adhering these materials to the base is very simple. I put a little bit of PVA glue down on a piece of paper, and then I use my brush, and I quite simply focus, and then brush on a layer of glue to the base. You do want to be careful. You don't want to get this on the miniature itself, or else you could potentially have rocks and debris, or whatever you decide to use, actually on the miniature itself. You can put as little or as much as you want. When it comes to how much material you use, I decided here I wanted to cover the whole base in these rocks. And then I dunked it right into the base and got everything to stick. You can sprinkle them on if you decide to do so, or adhere it in other ways, just pouring or mixing it on. But I simply just dunked it in there, tapped off the excess, and here you are. After I did this, I decided I'm going to put a few more larger stones on there to give it a little bit more variation. So for this, I opened up my container of larger stones and then chose a few spots that I wanted the larger rocks to be. And then I just dabbed on a little bit more glue in those areas. You have to watch it because sometimes you'll get actually some of the rocks from your already still wet base onto the brush. A way to avoid this is simply waiting for the glue to dry before you put the rocks, your second layer of rocks on. Either way is just fine. And then here, you can see them all fixed onto the base. Now it's important before you do any priming or anything else, you want this to dry. And PVA glue takes a little bit longer to dry, so I set that aside. And we will now move, after it's dried, to to the garage. So here in the garage, I have my wife's airbrush set up, and I'm running some airbrush cleaner through the airbrush itself. Airbrush is totally optional. It does make the process go a little bit faster, and it's a little bit easier if you decide to use it. Of course, one of the things with airbrushing is maintenance, and actually spend a little bit of time here to actually clean out the airbrush and make sure that there's no gunk or any previous paint that's still in there. And here I'm just simply mixing up some both white and black primer to give me a nice shade of gray, and I'm adding in a tiny little bit of airbrush thinner, or will be, to actually give a really nice flow to the primer so it can go through the airbrush. You'll notice here that I'm actually wearing gloves and a mask. I'm also doing this in a well-ventilated area. While many of acrylic paints are actually non-toxic, it is nice to make sure that you are not getting anything that you don't need into your lungs. So hence the mask. I'm doing it outside in a ventilated area, and also wearing gloves, so I'm getting anything on my hands, and that makes cleanup a lot easier. After the burr brush is cleaned out, I do a little bit of a test, and this is actually a mug that I 3D printed from a Kickstarter that can be used to hold cans and bottles in, and it looks relatively fancy. And I decided to include this in the video to show how fast and easy an airbrush could work when priming different surfaces. The green for the mug is just the color filament that I used for the mug itself. The filament for 3D printers comes in a wide variety of shades. We just happen to have green. One of the benefits actually to having a green mug is you can see areas that you missed very, very easily. And as you take a look through the time lapse here, you do see, even areas I go over, a little bit of green showing through. To fully cover it, you're going to need a lot more primer and a lot more paint and time. But I've found with my experience that as long as it's covered, if you see a little bit of the undercoat, you can, for the most part, be okay. One question that you sometimes see when it comes to primer is, do I need to use a specific type? If it sticks to plastic, it'll work. There are painters out there that use Rust-Oleum or Krylon or other brands of aerosol primers. Games Workshop, their Citadel paints actually has a aerosol primer, though it is a little bit more on the expensive side. Here, the primers that I'm using are from Vallejo. It's a paint company, a wild Vaultfox, and that was appeared. But I didn't have any gray, so I just happened to mix the white and black together to get the shade that I want. Now set that off to the side. Now let's get out my Sylvaneth Army, and we're going to begin doing some priming work on those. I do hope in the future to show a little bit more specifics on airbrushing and how to prime miniatures with paintbrush. That will actually be part of the next video when it comes into some base coating. Now, even though this video is sped up, the airbrushing process can go very, very quickly. It doesn't take too much time at all to fully cover a miniature, so that later on when we get to the painting stage, the miniature paint can adhere a lot faster, a lot easier. I did switch over to a white primer, as you can see here. Nice zoomed in shot of how fast and easy this goes. I decided to use a white primer, mostly so it will show up a lot better over top of the gray, so I know what areas I hit and what areas that I missed. When priming, whether with airbrush or with a paintbrush or an aerosol can, you want to make sure you get every surface covered. This way you don't have to worry about any paint in the future flaking, falling off, and that everything sticks onto the miniature fairly easily. Airbrushing does make all these little nooks and crannies very easily, but again, you can do this with a paintbrush. I've done the majority of the miniatures I have at this moment have been actually done with an airbrush. Now, let's get some things focused, and we'll move right on to our Arch-Revenant. Again, the biggest saver for airbrushing is time. This maybe took under a minute for the priming to take place for our Arch-Revenant. With a brush, it would take a little bit longer and may require an extra little bit of coat or some touch-up work, but here, after a few moments, we'll be ready to go. Now, it is possible to use numerous different types of paint through your airbrush. This can help with base coating, this can help with shading, and even some of the blending that you can do. However, I plan on mostly using a paintbrush through this process because not everyone owns an airbrush. And to be honest, this is actually my wife. She has the airbrush for most of her cosplay work. Link to her YouTube video is in the description below. And just like that, after a few moments, our Arch-Revenant is ready to go. I definitely made sure I had attention to the basing materials I put down on the bottom so that later on we can actually paint those nicely. And finally, just with a little bit of touch-up work with the airbrush, it'll come to a nice crisp white. And after this dries for a few hours, we will be ready to go and move on to the actual painting process, which in my opinion is some of the most fun that you can have with a miniature. And there we go. Relatively simple process to adhere any type of basing materials and also the priming process. Again, you don't necessarily need to use one specific type of primer. Lots of individuals use rattle cans such as Rust-Oleum or Krylon or any of the other variety of primers that you have out there. You can buy them in any local hardware store or any craft store. Any of those generally will work as long as it sticks to plastic. You'll be in pretty good shape. I chose to go with the airbrush method using Vallejo surface primer, mostly because that's simply what I had. Spraying generally is a little bit faster. It gets you a nice even coat. Yeah. But you don't necessarily have to use spraying. You can also paint on with a brush, though it might take an extra coat or two to get a full coverage over top of your miniature. Either which way you do it, priming is a great way to get started onto the painting process. So, I hope you found this video at least a little bit interesting, and also maybe a little bit informative. Next video, what we're going to be doing is actually laying down some base coats and getting the miniature ready for all the wonderful colors of paint that we'll be putting on it. So, until next time, I've been Fuzzo, and I shall return.